have another question, which is
Hmm.
what,
Sorry.
like, how exactly are operating systems made? Like, not in detail,
That's
obviously, but like,
yeah, yeah, cool, cool. Like, what I will say is basically, an operating system has like three layers. It's like there's user layer, okay, where users literally like interact. Then there's a kernel level or layer, you know, where things really happen. Whatever you interact with your user level, that goes down and interacts with actual, a little, let's say, base level uh, software. I don't know what to call that anymore.
okay,
And then it goes down to hardware. Okay, that the kernel level or layer interacts with your hardware. That's like the simple, like
I see.
most basic idea you can get about operating system.
Okay, so basically, like, I know this from a custom ROM viewpoint. Correct me if I'm wrong. So, a custom ROM, technically the word ROM is a misnomer. ते आता यूज करतात कारण की back in the day
Hmm.
it was like ROM attach करून game devices ला वगैरे ROM attach करायचे. So it is
Yeah.
technically a firmware, right? So
Hmm.
firmware is basically the software installed inside your hardware or on your hardware, right? Which allows you to
Correct.
interact with your hardware. Then the kernel is what transfers your input to the hardware and back,
Hmm.
right? And then the hardware is, yeah.
Yeah. Hmm. No, no, go ahead. I want to know what your idea is.
So and then the hardware is basically the hardware, what is physically available. And as far as I understand, these are the three layers: the firmware, the
Hmm.
kernel, which translates to back and from the to and from the user and the hardware, and then we have the hardware.
Hmm.
That's what I understand.
Oh, correct. Hmm. So in terms of Android, really, like it's like whatever you are installing, the custom ROM, it's about the kernel. So a Linux kernel actually. Android is basically a Linux kernel, by the way.
Yeah,
Yeah. So yeah, that's it. I mean, it is same like, as you said. It's just that it is not at the kernel level; it sits above the kernel level.
I see. So then,
Hmm.
if I were to, like, we had this conversation recently, so that's why I asked. What would you
Yeah.
say is a way to maybe optimize Android rather than improve it? Optimize करण्यासाठी what would you suggest?
Optimize in the sense the architecture or like.
Ha, like
I
essentially,
guess,
yeah.
yeah. Hmm. So we recently had this communication, me and a
Yes.
co about uh, so I have this there's like a lot of different types of operating systems that exist. For example, there's monolithic kernel. So what we use on Android is Linux, and Linux is, by the way, monolithic kernel. And
Okay.
what it does is like so in an operating system there are user level and kernel level. As I said, they have their own spaces. And when it comes to monolithic kernel, basically, let's say Android, you have a single space which has both user and kernel space. So you
I
basically
see.
have both user interactions and kernel interactions in the same space, and all of that actually works as a single process or as a single unit, I would say.
Yeah.
Okay, so there are a couple of things actually when it comes to operate an operating system. There are drivers. There's a lot of system calls happening down below. A lot of stuff. But what I
Yeah.
want to say is, when it comes to monolithic kernel, it interacts as a whole unit, right from user to hardware.
Yeah.
It's like an abstraction that doesn't have a lot of segregations.
I see.
Okay, that's something we use even till now. The Android is based upon that. But if you think about that, if you compare it with, I guess, iOS, for example, iOS uses microkernel. So microkernel is something which separates. the units. As I said before, like there's a single unit.
Mm-hmm.
What it does is there's a user level or user space or kernel space. So it separates these things into different units,
Yeah.
and even in these units there are different processes or different units like
Yeah.
subunits or something. I don't know what you would call that,
Mm-hmm.
but that's the thing, it separates the functionality among different, you know
Yeah.
kind of components, and those components are working independently,
Yeah.
interacting with each other and interacting with your hardware.
Mm-hmm.
And uh, that's what is amazing about microkernel. Why? The reason is the monolithic kernel is like, if you have some flaws or some problem in some specific component,
Mm-hmm.
and it is like literally serious, your whole system gets stuck,
I see.
because your operating system is busy committing to that problem, that issue.
Yeah.
While when it comes to microkernel, your other components are still going on along with their own ways, their own processes. If you have some single component which needs to be taken care of, the operating system does take care of that parallel in parallel with other components, say, in like simplest terms. So that's about it. That's where I guess the smooth experience of iOS comes from. Even Mac OS is based upon microkernels.
I see.
I guess Linux is still monolithic. The reason, I don't know. When it comes to computer usage, I guess it makes sense. You have full control over your system, but from
Yeah.
the user experience point of view, I guess microkernel makes a lot of sense to me. At least that's my opinion. But I guess the whatever I've said right now is something that cannot be implemented by someone in a out of the boom, because
Mm-hmm.
already we have Android and it has been growing like a lot. I
Yeah.
don't think anyone would want to replace that. But again, it's this question that what if we you know use some different kernel or create some different uh, architecture of kernel, that would if that would impact the overall usage. Because see, the overall
Mm-hmm.
storage and memory usage has been increasing a lot these days.
Yeah.
Apps have been having, as you said, so many abilities, so much processing is going on, so much computing. So I guess it's relevant to also optimize on the basis of what architecture you are using when it comes to operating system level.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's something I guess. Yeah.
Interesting. So
Hmm.
my question for this is, as you said, iOS and macOS वगैरह they use microkernel architecture.
Yeah.
Is it so that a microkernel can only be done if it's closed, or is there a possibility for it to be open source?
See, microkernel, I don't know if any open source, you know, I guess they might exist. I don't have an idea, but
Mm-hmm.
mostly open source operating systems are mostly like based upon Linux,
Yeah.
or like the monolithic architecture. The Unix, basically Unix
Hmm.
is totally monolithic architecture based.
Yeah.
But if we really need an open source microkernel based, I don't know, we'll search the marketplace if that does exist. I don't know, someone who has
Yeah.
you know created that and hasn't had any focus by anyone.
Mm-hmm.
But if that doesn't exist, it has to be created by
True.
someone great really, and it will need a lot of dedication and a lot of time. Because see, we have come a long way right now, and uh, if you want something to compete with even iOS,
Mm.
even to compete with that, it will take a really long time again to come back to that way. People
I
might
see.
do it, right? I
Hmm.
have no idea about that.
Just to clarify, for the
Hmm.
audience, when he says it is going to take a long way for us to compete with iOS, He's not talking about the performance per se. What he's saying is the structural efficiency that the microkernel architecture has is much higher than the monolithic architecture that Linux kernel has. And in order for us to reach there, as you said, it would take a significant amount of time and effort from some random programmer who's like, yes, open source GitHub पे अभी project बनाएंगे, which which is the beauty of the
Totally.
open source community, but it's also a big
Hmm.
downfall, or rather a downside to it. It
But
takes
I
time.
guess
Hmm.
even to develop that, it'll take good amount of resources.
True.
It comes to phones. I
Yeah.
mean, you need a hardware. You need to manufacture some good amount of hardware to test it out on. It can't be done by an individual until unless he has good amount of resources, or he's some developer working in Silicon Valley with a lot of salary.
Yeah.
Yeah, probably that's a possibility.